In the autumn of 1985, an elderly man walked into a television studio in New York City and committed an act of surrender that had been 40 years in the making. His hands, weathered by decades of manual labor and California sunshine, trembled slightly as he sat across from Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show. His accent, still detectably German despite 4 decades of careful modification, carried the weight of a secret that had defined every waking moment of his adult life. His name was Georg Gärtner. Or rather, it had been Georg Gärtner. For the previous 40 years, he had been Dennis Wiles, ski instructor, tennis organizer, husband, neighbor, friend. And for all those years, he had been America's most enduring fugitive from World War II. This is not a story about escape in the traditional sense. It's not about tunnels dug under barbed wire fences, forged documents, or daring midnight runs across hostile territory. This is a story about a different kind of escape, an escape from history itself, from the impossible choices created when borders are redrawn and homelands cease to exist. It's a story about what happens when a young man realizes that the war everyone else considers finished is, for him, just beginning. And it's a story about the extraordinary psychological endurance required to live an entire life as someone else, knowing that a single moment of carelessness could unravel everything. But to understand why Georg Gärtner jumped from a freight train in September 1945 and disappeared into America for 40 years, we need to begin not in New Mexico where he escaped, but in a place that no longer exists on any map. Schweidnitz. The name itself is now a ghost, replaced on modern maps by its Polish equivalent Świdnica. But in the 1920s, when Georg Gärtner was born there, Schweidnitz was a modest German town in Lower Silesia, part of the complex patchwork of territories that made up the Weimar Republic. Understanding Georg's story requires understanding the psychological reality of being from a place that would eventually cease to exist. Not metaphorically cease to exist, literally erased by the redrawing of national boundaries. Its German population expelled, its street names changed, its very identity transformed. For young Georg, growing up in Schweidnitz meant growing up in the long shadow of Germany's humiliation after World War I. The town, like much of Germany, carried the psychological burden of the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations, the territorial losses, the sense of national diminishment that would eventually create the conditions for Hitler's rise. We have limited information about Georg's childhood. He rarely spoke about it, even to his wife. But we know the contours of life in a small German town during the 1920s and 1930s. The economic devastation of hyperinflation, the political chaos of the Weimar Republic's final years, the gradual then sudden rise of National Socialism. By the time Georg reached military age, the transformation was complete. The humiliated nation of his childhood had become the aggressive, expansionist Third Reich, and like millions of young German men, he found himself swept into the machinery of Hitler's war. In 1943, Georg Gärtner was a sergeant in the Afrika Korps, part of Rommel's legendary desert campaign. The details of his service are sparse. We know he served, we know he survived, we know he was eventually captured. But the specifics of his combat experience, the things he saw and did, remained largely unspoken throughout his life. This silence is significant. Many German veterans of World War II carried similar silences, a kind of collective amnesia about their participation in Hitler's wars. Whether from shame, trauma, or simply the desire to move forward, an entire generation of German men emerged from the war with experiences they could not or would not articulate. What we do know is that in May 1943, the Afrika Korps was collapsing. Caught between British and American forces in Tunisia, roughly 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, one of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Georg Gärtner was among them. For most of these prisoners, capture represented the end of their war. They would spend the remainder of the conflict in POW camps, then eventually be repatriated once peace was declared. It was the expected trajectory, the normal conclusion, but for Georg Gärtner, capture was the beginning of a much more complex and prolonged ordeal. The journey from Tunisia to New Mexico would have taken weeks, first by ship across the Mediterranean, then across the Atlantic, then by rail deep into the American Southwest. For German prisoners of war, this journey must have carried a profound sense of disorientation. They had been fighting in the deserts of North Africa, in landscapes that, while foreign, were at least within the general sphere of European and Mediterranean experience. Now they were being transported to a place that existed almost entirely outside their frame of reference: the American Southwest. Vast expanses of empty land, small towns separated by hundreds of miles of desert, a landscape so different from the densely populated regions of Germany that it must have seemed like transportation to another planet. The United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war during World War II, scattered across hundreds of camps in virtually every state. This massive infrastructure was necessary because the Geneva Conventions required that prisoners be held in climates similar to where they were captured. Desert fighters from North Africa were therefore housed in the American Southwest. Camp Deming, New Mexico, where Georg was eventually sent, was typical of these facilities. Not particularly harsh by the standards of POW camps, the United States generally adhered to Geneva Convention requirements. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, were allowed to work for wages, could organize their own camp activities, receive mail, even attend educational classes. By the accounts of many German POWs, captivity in America was almost surreally comfortable compared to what they'd expected. Some later described it as the best period of their lives: regular meals, no combat, safety, even a kind of structured leisure. But there was a profound psychological dimension to this captivity that transcended the physical conditions. These men were watching their homeland being destroyed from thousands of miles away. They received limited, censored information about the progress of the war. They knew Germany was losing, but the full extent of the destruction, the bombing of cities, the casualties, the approaching Soviet armies was kept from them or arrived in fragments. And for Georg Gärtner, there was a specific, growing horror as the shape of the post-war world began to emerge. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 had redrawn the map of Eastern Europe. Poland would be moved westward, compensating for Soviet territorial gains in the east by absorbing large portions of eastern Germany. Silesia, including Schweidnitz, would become Polish territory. Let's pause to consider what this meant for someone like Georg. His hometown, the place he was born, where his family lived, where he'd spent his entire life before the war, would simply cease to be German. The population would be expelled. His family, if they'd survived the war, would become refugees. And all of this would happen in territory occupied by the Soviet Union. This is the crucial context for understanding Georg's decision. By the summer of 1945, as the war in Europe ended and German prisoners began preparing for repatriation, Georg was facing not just defeat, but a kind of existential erasure. Stories were filtering through the POW camps about what was happening to German soldiers in Soviet-occupied territories. These weren't just rumors or propaganda. They were based on genuine reports from the Red Cross, from escaped refugees, from the few communications that made it through from Eastern Europe. German soldiers returning to Soviet-occupied zones weren't being welcomed as defeated warriors. They were being treated as potential security threats, Nazi collaborators, ideologically contaminated individuals who needed to be re-educated or neutralized. The numbers are staggering. Of the approximately 3 million German prisoners held by the Soviet Union, nearly 1 million never returned. They died in labor camps in Siberia, from disease, starvation, cold, or simply disappeared into the vast archipelago of Soviet detention facilities. Georg Gärtner, sitting in Camp Deming in the summer of 1945, was doing a very simple calculation. If he returned to Soviet-occupied Silesia, to a town that was no longer called by its German name, to territory that was no longer Germany, what were his chances of survival? The calculation was not favorable. And so on September 21, 1945, 3 months after the war in Europe ended, Georg Gärtner made a decision that would define the rest of his life. September 21, 1945. By this date, the war was comprehensively over. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan had surrendered in August after the atomic bombings. The entire global conflict that had consumed 6 years and tens of millions of lives was finished. POW camps across America were processing German prisoners for repatriation. The logistics were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of men needed to be documented, organized by region of origin, transported to ports, shipped back to Europe, and then distributed to their home territories or, more accurately, to whatever authorities controlled those territories. For prisoners from Western Germany, this process was relatively straightforward. They would return to zones occupied by American, British, or French forces. They would face denazification proceedings, possibly some detention while their wartime activities were investigated, but generally their fate was predictable. For prisoners from Soviet-occupied territories, the calculation was entirely different. Georg Gärtner had been watching this process carefully. He'd observed which prisoners were being grouped together, which territories were being classified as Soviet zones, how the repatriation lists were being organized. And he'd made his decision. The details of the escape itself were almost mundane in their simplicity. No elaborate planning, no complex conspiracy, no dramatic confrontation. He simply walked away from a work detail near a rail yard in Deming, New Mexico, calculated the timing of a freight train, and jumped aboard. The ease of this escape reveals something important about the American POW system. By late 1945, security at many camps had relaxed considerably. The war was over. These men weren't dangerous enemy combatants anymore. They were just displaced persons waiting to go home. Guards had been reduced, surveillance had decreased, the sense of urgency had dissipated. In this atmosphere of post-war wind-down, a determined individual could simply slip away. What happened next is where Georg's story becomes remarkable. Because the escape itself, the physical act of leaving the camp, was just the beginning. The real escape, the one that would last 40 years, was the escape into a new identity. Imagine yourself in Georg Gärtner's position in late September 1945. You've just jumped from a freight train somewhere in the American Southwest. You have no identification, no money, no contacts, no legal right to be in the country. You speak English but with a pronounced German accent, and you're a fugitive from a prisoner of war camp at a moment when anti-German sentiment, while fading, is still considerable. How do you survive? The answer requires understanding the particular historical moment Georg found himself in. Post-war America was chaotic in ways that would become unimaginable in later decades. Millions of soldiers were being demobilized and reintegrating into civilian life. Entire populations had been displaced by the war. Immigration systems were overwhelmed. Record-keeping, while improving, was still largely paper-based and localized. Social security numbers existed but weren't yet mandatory for most employment. Driver's licenses weren't standardized across states. Background checks were rudimentary. The interconnected databases that would later make disappearing into a false identity nearly impossible simply didn't exist. In this environment, if you were willing to take on manual labor, move frequently, stay away from jobs that required extensive documentation, and maintain a consistently low profile, you could build a life under a false name. Georg's first creation was the identity itself, Dennis Wiles. The genius of this name was its utterly forgettable quality. Not too ethnic, not too distinctive. Dennis, a common American name. Wiles, uncommon enough that there wouldn't be many others to compare against, but plausible enough that it didn't raise questions. He constructed a backstory around this identity that was simultaneously simple and complete. He was an orphan. Parents killed in an accident when he was young, grew up in various foster situations. No close family, no deep roots anywhere. This story did two crucial things. First, it explained why he had no documentation, no family connections, no traceable past. Second, it discouraged questions. The orphan story carried an implicit social prohibition against prying. It would be rude to demand details about someone's painful childhood. His German accent was more challenging. He couldn't eliminate it entirely, so he transformed it. He claimed to have grown up in various places, picking up linguistic influences. The accent became vaguely European, sophisticated rather than specifically German. In the cosmopolitan environments where he eventually settled, this accent became an asset. It made him interesting, worldly, slightly mysterious. The first years were precarious. He moved frequently, taking whatever work he could find. Construction, agricultural labor, itinerant jobs where employers asked few questions and paid in cash. He developed a keen instinct for reading situations, for knowing when to move on before questions started accumulating. But Georg, now Dennis, had a skill that would eventually provide him with both livelihood and cover. He was an excellent skier. How he learned to ski in Silesia before the war we don't know precisely, but skiing was becoming increasingly popular in Germany in the 1930s, part of the broader Nazi emphasis on physical fitness and outdoor activities. Whatever the origins of his skill, Dennis Wiles arrived in California in the late 1940s with the ability to ski at an expert level. California's ski industry was in its infancy. The Sierra Nevada mountains offered spectacular terrain, but the infrastructure was primitive compared to European ski resorts. There was a hunger for skilled instructors, for people who could teach the growing American middle class how to navigate slopes with European sophistication. Dennis Wiles became a ski instructor, and in this role he found something approaching security. By the early 1950s, Dennis Wiles had achieved something remarkable. He had become a real person, not legally real. His identity was still entirely fictional, built on fabricated stories and careful evasions, but socially, culturally, psychologically real. He had friends who knew him as Dennis. He had employers who trusted him. He had a reputation in California ski communities as a talented instructor with a charming European manner. He taught skiing in the winter at various California resorts. In the off-season, he took construction jobs, sales positions, whatever work sustained him. He lived modestly but not suspiciously so. He socialized but maintained careful boundaries. He was friendly but not too close, helpful but not intrusive. This calibration, being present enough to seem normal but distant enough to avoid deep scrutiny, required constant psychological vigilance. Every conversation was a potential minefield. Every new acquaintance was a risk. Every piece of documentation requested was a moment of danger. Consider the everyday experiences most people take for granted, and imagine navigating them with a false identity. Getting a driver's license, opening a bank account, renting an apartment, applying for jobs. Each of these required documentation, and each piece of documentation was a potential point of exposure. Dennis developed strategies for each situation. He always paid cash when possible. When documentation was absolutely necessary, he used the Social Security number he'd carefully constructed, a number that technically existed in the system but attached to a person who didn't. He moved between jobs and locations frequently enough that no single employer or institution had a complete picture of his life. But alongside these pragmatic strategies, something more profound was happening. Dennis Wiles was becoming real through the simple accumulation of lived experience. He formed genuine friendships. Not deep friendships where he revealed his full history, but real connections based on shared interests, mutual respect, common experiences. He helped people. He was reliable. He showed up when he said he would. He kept his promises. In the ski community, he became known for organizing charity tournaments. He had a talent for bringing people together, for creating events that were both fun and meaningful. He worked with celebrities who vacationed in California ski resorts, people like Elizabeth Taylor, Robert Stack, others whose names carried cachet. These weren't calculated moves to create cover, though they had that effect. They were genuine expressions of Dennis's, of Georg's personality. He liked organizing things. He enjoyed bringing people together. He found satisfaction in contributing to his community. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex dimension of his story. The performance of being Dennis Wiles gradually became indistinguishable from actually being Dennis Wiles. The false identity, maintained over decades, accrued enough genuine experience that it ceased to be entirely false. Philosophers and psychologists have long debated questions of personal identity. What makes you you? Is it your memories? Your relationships? Your name and legal documentation? Your accumulated experiences and choices? Georg Gärtner was conducting an inadvertent 40-year experiment in these questions. He had memories of being Georg, of Schweidnitz, of the war, but he was accumulating far more extensive memories of being Dennis of California, of the life he was building. Which identity was more real? The FBI, meanwhile, had not forgotten about him. His escape had been noted. His photograph was circulated. Georg Gärtner appeared on wanted lists, though notably not on lists of dangerous criminals. The FBI understood that he wasn't a threat. He hadn't escaped to commit violence or sabotage. He'd escaped to avoid repatriation. The wanted poster shows a stern-faced young man in military uniform. The man teaching skiing in California looked nothing like this. Older, tanned, relaxed American in his presentation. The psychological distance between the photograph and the lived reality was enormous. But the wanted poster existed in post offices across America. And Georg, Dennis, lived with the knowledge that at any moment someone might make the connection. In 1964, Dennis Wiles met Jean Clark. She was drawn to his European sophistication, his mysterious quality, his reluctance to discuss his past. He told her he'd been an orphan, that his childhood had been difficult, that he preferred to focus on the present rather than dwelling on painful memories. Jean accepted this. She was compassionate, and she interpreted his silence as trauma that needed respect rather than interrogation. This was not unusual for the era. Many people in the 1960s carried silences about their pasts. Veterans who wouldn't discuss combat, immigrants who'd left behind painful circumstances, people who'd survived the Depression with memories they preferred not to revisit. Dennis's silence fit into this broader cultural pattern of acceptable reticence. They married, built a home together, created a shared life that was, by all external measures, entirely normal. Jean believed she knew her husband. She knew his habits, his preferences, his personality, his values. She knew Dennis Wiles. What she didn't know was that Dennis Wiles was Georg Gärtner, that her husband was a fugitive, that their entire relationship was built on a foundation of necessary deception. The psychological burden of this secret on Georg was immense. Marriage requires intimacy, and intimacy requires honesty. But Georg could not be honest without risking everything. So he maintained the performance even with the person closest to him. Imagine the constant vigilance required. Every story you tell your spouse must be consistent with your fabricated past. Every family event, every holiday, every moment when normal people would share childhood memories or discuss relatives, you must carefully navigate around the truth. When Jean's family asked about his background, he repeated the orphan story. When old photographs were shared, he had none to contribute. When travel opportunities arose that would require a passport, he found reasons to decline. Over 20 years of marriage, these moments accumulated. The trips they couldn't take. The questions he deflected. The parts of himself he couldn't share. Jean noticed, of course. She wasn't oblivious. But she interpreted these gaps as pain rather than deception. She thought she was being respectful of his traumatic past by not pushing too hard for details. This misunderstanding allowed the marriage to function, but it created an asymmetry that was ultimately unsustainable. Jean was fully present in the relationship, sharing her complete self. Georg was only partially present, maintaining a careful performance even in moments of intimacy. The loneliness of this situation is difficult to overstate. Georg had successfully escaped from a POW camp, created a new identity, built a life, married, integrated into American society. By external measures, he'd achieved a kind of triumph, but he was profoundly alone in a way that no one around him could understand. He knew something about himself that no one else knew. He carried memories of a town that no longer existed, of a life before Dennis Wiles, of experiences he could never discuss. He had successfully escaped the Soviet occupation of Silesia, but he'd done so by imprisoning himself in a false identity that couldn't accommodate his full history. By the early 1980s, this burden was becoming unbearable. The proximate cause of Georg's revelation was Jean's threat to leave him. By 1984, their marriage had deteriorated to the point where she had packed her bags and called a taxi. The specifics of the argument that precipitated this crisis aren't fully documented, but the underlying issue was clear. Jean felt she was living with someone she didn't truly know. She was right. Of course, though not in the way she understood, Georg faced an impossible choice. He could let her leave, preserving his secret but losing his marriage. Or he could tell her the truth and risk losing not just his marriage but potentially his freedom, his constructed life, everything he'd built over 40 years. The fact that he chose to reveal the truth suggests how desperate the situation had become. The psychological cost of maintaining the secret had exceeded the psychological cost of exposure. Imagine the beginning of this conversation. How do you start explaining to your wife of 20 years that you've been lying about your identity since before you met? How do you convey that you're not the person she married, or rather, that you are that person but also someone else entirely? Georg apparently began with the simple facts. His real name was Georg Gärtner. He was from Silesia. He'd been a German prisoner of war who escaped in 1945. Everything he'd told her about being an orphan was fabricated. Jean's initial response was, understandably, shock and betrayal. Her entire conception of their marriage, of their shared history of who he was, had to be fundamentally revised. The man she'd known as Dennis Wiles was simultaneously real and fictional. But as the conversation continued, as Georg explained not just what he'd done but why, the Soviet occupation of Silesia, the fate of German prisoners in Soviet territories, the impossible choice between repatriation and escape, Jean began to understand the context. This wasn't a man who'd lied for malicious reasons. This wasn't deception for personal gain or to harm others. This was a lie born of desperation, of the desire to survive, of circumstances that had forced an impossible choice. Jean made a decision that reveals remarkable compassion and psychological flexibility. She chose to stay, not immediately, not without conditions. The taxi left without her, but she needed time to process this revelation. They likely had many difficult conversations in the following days and weeks. She would have needed to decide whether the man she'd known as Dennis Wiles, the man whose personality, values, and behaviors she'd experienced over 20 years, was real, even if his name and backstory were fabricated. Eventually, she concluded that he was. The performance had become the reality. Dennis Wiles was Georg Gärtner, and Georg Gärtner was Dennis Wiles. They were the same person, just with a more complicated history than she'd understood. But John also recognized that this secret, now shared between them, was unsustainable. Georg had been living as a fugitive for nearly 40 years. He was in his 60s. The psychological burden of maintaining the false identity, even now that Jean knew the truth, was destroying him. They began discussing the possibility of surrender. Not as defeat, but as liberation. On September 11, 1985, Georg Gärtner walked into the NBC studios in New York City and sat down for an interview with Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show. The interview would be broadcast live. There would be no opportunity for the government to intercept him before he made his story public. This choice of venue was strategic. By surrendering on live television, Georg was controlling the narrative. He wasn't being captured, he was choosing to reveal himself. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was presenting his case directly to the American public. The interview itself was remarkable for its tone. Gumbel treated Georg not as a criminal, but as a historical curiosity, a man with an extraordinary story to tell. Georg, for his part, was calm, articulate, willing to answer questions without defensiveness. He explained his escape, his reasons, his fear of Soviet repatriation. He described the life he'd built as Dennis Wiles. He acknowledged the deception but contextualized it within the impossible circumstances of 1945. The American public's response was overwhelmingly sympathetic. This wasn't a Nazi fugitive trying to escape justice for war crimes. This was an elderly man who'd escaped from a POW camp 40 years ago to avoid being sent to Soviet-occupied territory. Whatever threat he might have posed in 1945, he clearly posed no threat in 1985. The legal system struggled to know how to respond. Technically, Georg had violated the terms of his prisoner of war status by escaping. But the war had been over for 40 years. The Soviet Union, which might have had a claim on his repatriation, had transformed considerably since 1945. Germany, divided since the war, had no clear jurisdiction. The Immigration and Naturalization Service interviewed Georg extensively. They reviewed his life as Dennis Wiles. They looked for evidence of criminal activity, of Nazi sympathies, of any reason to prosecute or deport him. They found nothing. Dennis Wiles had been, by all accounts, a model member of his community. He'd worked hard, paid taxes under his false identity, admittedly, contributed to charitable causes, formed positive relationships. He'd committed no crimes beyond the original escape and the identity fraud necessary to sustain it. The question became, what purpose would be served by prosecuting him? Deporting him where? To Germany, which had no interest in an elderly former Wehrmacht soldier? To Poland, which controlled his former hometown but had no connection to him? To Russia, which was no longer the Soviet Union that he'd feared in 1945. After considerable deliberation, the INS decided not to prosecute. Instead, they granted him legal residency status. He could remain in the United States as Georg Gärtner. Legally this time, the decision was pragmatic, but it also reflected a kind of moral exhaustion with the legacies of World War II. 40 years after the war's end, prosecuting an elderly man for escaping a POW camp simply didn't serve any compelling purpose. It wouldn't bring justice to victims. It wouldn't deter future violations. There were no more POW camps to escape from. It would simply punish someone who'd already served his own kind of sentence. 40 years of constant vigilance and psychological imprisonment in a false identity. Georg Gärtner was free. Legally publicly free for the first time since 1945. The years following Georg's public revelation were a period of profound psychological adjustment. For 4 decades, he'd maintained a strict separation between his public identity, Dennis Wiles, and his private history, Georg Gärtner from Schweidnitz. Now these identities had to somehow coexist. He continued to go by Dennis Wiles in most contexts. This wasn't an attempt to maintain deception. Everyone who knew him was now aware of his dual identity. But Dennis Wiles was who he'd been for longer than he'd been Georg Gärtner. The name had become authentic through decades of use. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and historians interested in his story. These interviews reveal a complex relationship with his own past. He spoke about his escape matter-of-factly, without particular pride or shame. It had been necessary, and he'd succeeded, and that was that. He was less willing to discuss his time in the Wehrmacht or his experiences in North Africa. Like many German veterans of World War II, he carried an ambivalence about his service. Recognition that he'd been part of a monstrous enterprise, but also awareness that he'd been a young man swept up in circumstances beyond his individual control. The question of collective versus individual guilt is one that Germany as a nation struggled with for decades after the war. Georg's personal grappling with this question mirrored the larger national struggle. He'd served Hitler's military, but he didn't consider himself a Nazi. He'd participated in the war, but he'd committed no atrocities. He'd been a small part of a vast machine, neither heroic nor villainous, just surviving. This kind of moral ambiguity is uncomfortable. We prefer clear narratives where people are either perpetrators or victims, resistors or collaborators. Georg existed in the messy middle, someone who'd participated in a terrible cause without being a true believer, who'd escaped not from guilt but from fear of Soviet occupation. His relationship with Jean deepened after the revelation. The removal of the secret allowed for a new kind of intimacy. She now knew his complete story, understood the full context of his life. Their marriage, built initially on partial truths, was reconstructed on a foundation of complete honesty. John later described this period as challenging but ultimately strengthening. She'd had to fundamentally revise her understanding of who her husband was, but the man revealed by this revision was, in most essential ways, the person she'd always known. The Dennis Wiles she'd married was genuinely Georg Gärtner. The performance had been so sustained, so comprehensive, that it had become authentic. In 2009, at age 83, Georg Gärtner became a United States citizen. The naturalization ceremony was unremarkable except for one extraordinary fact. The man taking the oath of allegiance had lived in America for 64 years, 59 of them under a false identity. The oath of citizenship requires renouncing allegiance to foreign powers. For Georg, this was particularly loaded. He'd renounced Nazi Germany implicitly by escaping the POW camp. He'd renounced the Soviet-occupied Silesia by refusing to return. He'd been effectively stateless for 6 decades. The citizenship oath finally gave him an official homeland, not the one he was born in, but the one he'd chosen and built a life in. The clerk administering the oath likely had no idea of this history. For them, it was just another naturalization, one of thousands conducted every year. But for Georg, it represented the final legal legitimization of a life built in the margins. Georg Gärtner never returned to Schweidnitz, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Even after Poland opened its borders, even after travel to his birthplace became not just possible but relatively easy, he never went back. This refusal is significant. Many displaced Germans eventually made pilgrimages to their former hometowns, now Polish cities with changed names and populations. These visits were often melancholic, seeing familiar buildings with unfamiliar signs, walking streets where no one spoke German, recognizing the geography but not the culture. Georg's refusal to return suggests something deeper than pragmatic concerns about travel at an advanced age. It suggests that he'd made a psychological decision to accept that Schweidnitz, his Schweidnitz, the German town of his childhood, no longer existed and never would again. The city of Schweidnica exists. It's a real place with real people, a functioning Polish city with its own history and identity, but it's not Schweidnitz. The population that lived there in Georg's childhood was expelled or fled in 1945-1946. The German names were changed to Polish names. The churches that had been Protestant were converted or replaced. The language, culture, administration, everything that made it the place Georg knew, was replaced. Returning would mean confronting the physical evidence of this erasure. Better perhaps to maintain the memories of the place that had been, than to replace them with the reality of what it had become. This decision reflects a broader truth about displacement and identity. The refugees and displaced persons of World War II, and there were tens of millions of them, faced not just physical displacement, but ontological displacement. They were from places that no longer existed, at least not in the form they remembered. Georg's response was to create a new place, a new identity, a new life entirely. Unlike many displaced persons who maintained connections to their lost homelands through exile communities and cultural preservation, Georg performed a more radical act. He simply became someone else from nowhere in particular, building an identity forward rather than anchoring it to an irretrievable past. In his final years, Georg spoke occasionally about Silesia, but always in abstract terms. He didn't dwell on specific memories of childhood streets or family gatherings. When asked about his hometown, he would acknowledge it as a place he was from, but not a place he belonged to anymore. This distinction, between being from somewhere and belonging there, is crucial. Georg was from Schweidnitz, but he belonged to California, to the ski slopes where he'd taught, to the communities where he'd lived as Dennis Wiles, to the life he'd built over 60 years. The question of where Georg truly belonged perhaps has no satisfactory answer. He existed in the spaces between official identities, between legal categories, between the person he'd been born as and the person he'd created himself to be. Georg Gärtner's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, documentation, and belonging. In an era of increasingly sophisticated surveillance systems, his 40-year evasion of detection seems almost impossible. Modern readers might wonder, how could someone simply invent a new identity and sustain it for decades? The answer reveals how much our relationship to official identity has transformed in the past half-century. The interconnected databases, biometric identification, mandatory documentation requirements that we now take for granted simply didn't exist in 1945. Social Security numbers existed but weren't universally required. Driver's licenses weren't standardized. Background checks were primitive. International communication was slow. Record-keeping was localized and paper-based. In this environment, if you were willing to stay in the margins, take cash jobs, avoid situations requiring deep documentation, move frequently enough that no single institution had a complete picture of your life, you could construct a functional false identity. But the more profound question isn't about the mechanics of identity fraud. It's about what constitutes authentic identity in the first place. Georg lived as Dennis Wiles for far longer than he'd lived as Georg Gärtner. The experiences he accumulated as Dennis, the relationships he formed, the person he became through decades of daily choices, were these less real because the name was invented? Contemporary philosophy has grappled extensively with questions of personal identity. The classic thought experiment asks, if all your memories were replaced with false ones, would you still be you? Georg's life presented an inverted version of this question. If you live under a false name but accumulate genuine experiences, do you become the person the false name represents? The evidence suggests yes. The people who knew Dennis Wiles weren't deceived about his fundamental character. They were only deceived about his background. His personality, his values, his behavior, his relationships, these were authentic, even if the name attached to them was fabricated. This raises a challenging question for our modern obsession with documentation and verification. We've built elaborate systems to ensure people are who they claim to be. to prevent identity fraud, to maintain the integrity of legal personhood. These systems serve important purposes, preventing crime, ensuring accountability, maintaining social trust. But Georg's story suggests these systems also have costs. They make it nearly impossible for someone to escape circumstances that have made their legal identity dangerous. A refugee fleeing persecution, a person escaping domestic violence, someone whose official identity has become a trap. Modern systems offer them fewer opportunities for the kind of radical self-reinvention that Georg achieved. The bureaucratic apparatus we've constructed assumes that your legal identity should follow you everywhere, that your past should always be accessible, that documentation of who you've been is essential to verifying who you are. This assumption serves most people well most of the time. But for people in circumstances like Georg's, where legal identity has become incompatible with survival, this apparatus can be suffocating. Georg's story also illuminates something about the nature of immigration and belonging. The United States has always been, in part, a nation of people reinventing themselves, leaving behind old identities to construct new ones. The mythology of America includes this possibility, that you can arrive from elsewhere and become American through choice and effort, rather than through birthright. Georg took this mythology to an extreme. He didn't immigrate legally. He jumped a freight train while escaping a POW camp. He didn't gradually assimilate while maintaining his original identity. He constructed an entirely new persona. He didn't wait for legal permission to belong. He simply decided he belonged, and lived that decision until the legal system eventually agreed. This is not to romanticize identity fraud or suggest that laws around documentation are unnecessary. Georg's case was extraordinary precisely because it was unique. But it does suggest that our legal categories sometimes fail to capture the complexity of human circumstances. The story resonates particularly in our current moment of heightened attention to documentation, immigration status, and borders. Georg's 40-year existence outside official identity demonstrates both the possibility and the cost of living beyond legal recognition. He achieved a kind of freedom from a past that had become unlivable, but at the price of constant vigilance, isolation, and the inability to fully share himself with others. Throughout his 40 years as Dennis Wiles, Georg was calculating risk with every decision. Should he accept this job that requires more documentation? Should he move to avoid someone asking too many questions? Should he socialize more to appear normal, or less to avoid scrutiny? Every choice carried potential consequences. Risk assessment of this kind requires a particular psychological profile. You must be simultaneously paranoid and functional, constantly aware of danger while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Too much caution and you become suspicious. The person who never travels, never shares personal history, never forms close relationships. Too little caution and you expose yourself through carelessness. Georg apparently achieved a remarkable balance. He was social enough to avoid being seen as a recluse, but not so intimate that people probed deeply into his past. He was successful enough to be respected, but not so prominent that he attracted unwanted attention. He contributed to his communities in ways that generated goodwill and trust, but didn't put himself in positions where extensive background verification would be required. This balancing act required constant calibration. The appropriate level of openness in 1950s California was different from the appropriate level in 1970s California. The documentation required for a ski instructor was different from that required for other professions. The questions considered acceptable in casual conversation evolved over decades. Georg had to track all these changes and adjust his performance accordingly. Consider specific scenarios he must have faced repeatedly. Someone at a party asks where you grew up. Do you stick with the vague orphan story? Invent specific details? Change the subject? Each approach carries risks. Vagueness can seem evasive. Invented details must be remembered and kept consistent. Changing the subject too often becomes noticeable. Or consider more consequential situations. You need to open a bank account. Apply for a driver's license. Sign a lease. Each requires documentation. Each creates a paper trail. Each is an opportunity for someone to notice inconsistencies, to ask questions, to investigate further. Georg navigated these situations thousands of times over 40 years. And he succeeded thousands of times. But the psychological cost of this constant vigilance is difficult to quantify. Every interaction was potentially dangerous. Every document was a risk. Every new person in his life was someone who might discover the truth. Sleep must have been difficult. The kind of rest that requires fully lowering your guard would have been rare, even in his own home, even with his wife, before she knew. He had to maintain elements of the performance. There was no space where he could be completely, unself-consciously himself. This kind of sustained psychological pressure produces distinctive patterns of trauma. Not the acute trauma of a single terrible event, but the chronic trauma of ongoing threat. The hypervigilance required for such long-term deception rewires neural pathways, creates permanent alterations in how you process information and assess danger. Georg's decision to finally surrender in 1985 can be understood partly as exhaustion. After 40 years of constant risk calculation, the burden had become unbearable. The revelation to Jean was a crack in the facade that, once opened, revealed the unsustainability of the whole structure. Better to face whatever legal consequences might come than to continue carrying that weight for whatever years remained. Georg Gärtner's story raises an uncomfortable question. How many others are there? How many people are living under false identities, sustained over years or decades, for reasons ranging from the desperate to the criminal? We know of Georg only because he chose to reveal himself. The FBI had been looking for him for 40 years and never found him. He wasn't captured, he surrendered voluntarily. This suggests that the systems we rely on to verify identity and track fugitives have significant limitations. The historical context of Georg's escape, the chaos of post-World War II America, the primitive state of record-keeping, the absence of interconnected databases, made his sustained deception more feasible than it would be today. But even contemporary systems have gaps. People still disappear into false identities, though presumably for shorter periods and with greater difficulty. The reasons for assuming false identities vary enormously. Georg's motivation, fear of Soviet repatriation, was specific to his historical moment, but other motivations persist across eras. People fleeing domestic violence, individuals escaping organized crime, refugees from persecution who can't access legal immigration channels, people whose legal identities have been destroyed by identity theft or bureaucratic error, and of course criminals, people evading prosecution, hiding assets, escaping consequences of their actions. The false identity phenomenon encompasses both sympathetic and unsympathetic cases, which complicates our moral evaluation of it. Georg's case is generally regarded sympathetically because his motivation was survival rather than crime, and his life as Dennis Wiles was peaceful and productive. But this sympathy depends on accepting his narrative about why he escaped, his fear of Soviet occupation, as legitimate. Interestingly, the FBI seems to have accepted this narrative. The wanted posters described him as a fugitive but never suggested he was dangerous. The post-surrender investigation focused on verifying his story, rather than assuming it was pretextual. The decision not to prosecute reflected a judgment that his motivation was genuine, and his subsequent life validated his claim to have been simply trying to survive. But how many other fugitives have stories that might be similarly sympathetic if we knew them fully? How many people living under assumed names are doing so because their legal identities have become incompatible with their survival or well-being? These questions have become more urgent in recent years as identity verification systems have become more sophisticated and comprehensive. The spaces where people like Georg could disappear have shrunk dramatically. Biometric identification, interconnected databases, digital trails, these make long-term identity deception vastly more difficult. This increasing sophistication serves important purposes. It makes it harder for criminals to evade justice, harder for terrorists to operate under false identities, harder for people to commit fraud, but it also makes it harder for people in Georg's position, people whose legal identities have become traps, to escape. Modern refugee systems theoretically provide legal pathways for people fleeing persecution, but these systems are overwhelmed, bureaucratically complex, and often inaccessible to the people who most need them. Someone in Georg's position today, a German soldier captured in North Africa, facing repatriation to Soviet-occupied territory, might have legal options for claiming refugee status. But accessing those options would require navigating bureaucratic systems while detained, without legal representation. In a foreign country, Georg's solution, Simply jumping a train and inventing a new life was crude but effective. Modern systems have closed off this option, but they haven't necessarily replaced it with reliable alternatives for people in desperate circumstances. The revelation scene between Georg and Jean in 1984 represents one of the most psychologically complex moments in this entire story. Imagine being Jean in this moment. Your husband of 20 years has just told you that his name is not his name, his backstory is fabricated, and he's a fugitive from World War II. Everything you thought you knew about his past is false. How do you process this information? The betrayal is fundamental. He married you under false pretenses. But the person you've known for 20 years, his personality, his values, his daily behavior, that person is real. So who have you been married to? Jean's decision to stay with Georg after this revelation suggests several possible interpretations. Perhaps she recognized that the deception, while profound, was born of desperation rather than malice. Perhaps she concluded that the Dennis Wiles she'd known for 20 years was genuinely Georg Gärtner, that the false name hadn't created a false person. Perhaps she simply loved him enough to absorb this shock and reconstruct their relationship on a new foundation of complete honesty. Or perhaps all of these simultaneously. Human motivations are rarely singular. The question of what Georg owed Jean ethically is complex. One perspective holds that he had a moral obligation to reveal his true identity before marrying her. That marrying someone under a false name is an unforgivable deception that vitiates consent. Another perspective holds that his circumstances, the need to maintain his false identity to survive, created an impossible, ethical situation where full honesty would have required him to either give up on marriage entirely or expose himself to capture. There's no easy resolution to this dilemma. Georg's choice to maintain the deception throughout their marriage harmed Jean by denying her full knowledge of who she'd married. But revealing the truth earlier would have placed an enormous burden on her, making her complicit in harboring a fugitive, forcing her to maintain his secret, potentially exposing her to legal consequences. The ethics of deception become particularly complex when the deception is necessary for survival. Most ethical frameworks acknowledge that lying is sometimes justified, to protect someone from harm, to prevent greater wrongs, in situations where truth would cause disproportionate damage. Georg's sustained deception falls somewhere in this murky territory. After the revelation and his public surrender, Georg and Jean's marriage apparently entered a new phase. The removal of the secret allowed for a different kind of intimacy. Jean now understood the full context of his silences, his evasions, his refusal to travel internationally. What she'd interpreted as psychological damage from his orphan childhood, she now understood as the necessary caution of someone living under a false identity. In interviews after the surrender, Jean spoke about this period with remarkable equanimity. She acknowledged the difficulty of the revelation, but also emphasized the continuity of the person she'd known. The Dennis, while she'd married, was still the person she was married to. He just had a more complicated history than she'd understood. This response suggests psychological flexibility that not everyone possesses. Many people, confronted with such a fundamental deception, would conclude that the entire relationship was compromised, that they never really knew their spouse at all. Jean apparently concluded the opposite, that she'd known the essential person all along, and the false name and fabricated backstory, while significant, didn't negate the authenticity of their shared life. The question of what we owe our intimate partners in terms of honesty about our pasts is culturally and individually variable. Some relationships are built on exhaustive mutual knowledge, partners who share everything, who consider any withholding a betrayal. Other relationships respect boundaries, allowing partners to maintain private spaces in their histories. Georg and Jean's relationship was forced to navigate this question in extreme form. Not minor withholding or selective sharing, but fundamental deception about identity itself. The fact that their marriage survived this revelation suggests either extraordinary forgiveness on Jean's part, or a philosophical position that identity is more about who you are in the present than what name you were born with. Georg Gärtner's story intersects with a particular strain of American mythology, the good German. This is the narrative of German soldiers who weren't Nazis, who fought for their country but not for Hitler's ideology, who were conscripted rather than volunteers, who were victims of circumstances rather than perpetrators of atrocities. This narrative serves an important psychological function in American memory of World War II. It allows for moral complexity in a conflict that's often presented in stark good versus evil terms. It acknowledges that individual soldiers on the German side might have been as unwilling participants as soldiers on the Allied side, conscripted by circumstances of birth and historical moment. Georg fits this narrative almost perfectly. He was captured in North Africa before the full extent of Nazi atrocities became widely known. He wasn't SS, he was Wehrmacht, regular army. He wasn't involved in the Eastern Front where the worst German war crimes occurred. He wasn't guarding concentration camps or participating in massacres. He was a soldier fighting in a conventional military campaign who was captured and became a prisoner of war. After his escape, he lived a peaceful, productive life. He wasn't plotting Nazi revival or connecting with other fugitive Germans. He was teaching skiing and organizing charity tournaments. This narrative of the harmless German who just wanted to build a normal life resonated with American audiences in 1985. But this narrative also requires careful examination. The distinction between Wehrmacht and SS, between regular soldiers and war criminals, between people who fought for Germany and people who fought for Nazism, is more complicated than popular memory often acknowledges. The Wehrmacht, while not directly running death camps, was deeply involved in war crimes on the Eastern Front. German soldiers participated in mass shootings of civilians, in reprisal killings, in the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. The clean Wehrmacht myth, the idea that regular German soldiers fought honorably while only the SS committed atrocities, has been thoroughly debunked by historians. This doesn't necessarily implicate Georg personally. He was captured in North Africa in 1943. We have no evidence he participated in atrocities, but it complicates the easy narrative of the innocent German soldier. Georg himself rarely spoke about his military service in detail. This silence is characteristic of many Wehrmacht veterans, who emerged from the war into a Germany that was collectively grappling with guilt and responsibility. The easiest position was to claim ignorance of the worst crimes, to emphasize the distinction between fighting for Germany and supporting Nazi ideology, to present oneself as someone swept up in historical forces beyond individual control. These claims were sometimes true and sometimes self-serving. Distinguishing between them requires detailed knowledge of individual service records, which Georg apparently never made fully public. The American public's sympathy for Georg in 1985 reflected several factors. By that point, World War II had been over for 40 years. The generation that had fought the war was aging. The Cold War had transformed Germany from enemy to ally. The stark moral clarity of fighting Hitler had been complicated by decades of proxy wars and moral ambiguities. In this context, an elderly German who'd escaped a POW camp because he feared Soviet occupation fit neatly into Cold War narratives. He wasn't escaping American justice, he was escaping communism. This framing made him almost a sympathetic figure, someone who'd chosen the West even before the Cold War had fully crystallized. But we should be cautious about accepting this framing uncritically. Georg's decision to escape wasn't primarily ideological, it was personal. He feared what would happen to German soldiers in Soviet-occupied territory, and that fear was well-founded. But this doesn't automatically make him a cold warrior or a victim of communism in any meaningful political sense. He was, more simply, someone trying to survive circumstances he hadn't chosen and couldn't control. The historical accident of his capture in North Africa, rather than on the Eastern Front, his imprisonment in America rather than the Soviet Union, created the opportunity for escape. He took it. In our contemporary moment, Georg's story resonates with renewed urgency because we're living through intensified debates about documentation, immigration, and identity verification. The systems that would have made his 40-year deception impossible have been built and refined over the past several decades. Modern identity verification rests on several interconnected systems: social security numbers that are checked against centralized databases, driver's licenses that require extensive documentation and photo identification, background checks that can access employment history, criminal records, credit reports, biometric identification including fingerprints and facial recognition, digital trails from email accounts, social media, online transactions. These systems create a comprehensive web of verification that makes assuming a false identity extraordinarily difficult. Every interaction leaves traces. Every document creates connections. Every transaction generates data. The spaces where someone like Georg could disappear have been systematically eliminated. This increased sophistication serves real purposes. It makes identity theft more difficult. It helps prevent fraud. It allows law enforcement to track criminals more effectively. It creates accountability in a complex modern economy where transactions often occur between parties who've never met. But these systems also have costs that are less frequently acknowledged. They make it nearly impossible for people to escape circumstances that have made their legal identities dangerous. They create situations where people's pasts follow them indefinitely. They eliminate the possibility of the kind of radical fresh start that Georg achieved. Consider someone fleeing domestic violence who wants to disappear completely to avoid an abusive partner. Modern systems make this extremely difficult. Your social security number is attached to employment. Your driver's license is linked to your legal name. Your digital presence, email accounts, social media, online activity creates a trail. Banks require extensive verification. Landlords check credit history. Employers conduct background checks. You can change your name legally, but that creates a public record connecting your old and new identities. You can try to minimize your digital footprint, but participating in modern economy requires some digital presence. You can move frequently, but housing increasingly requires documentation and verification. The net result is that people in desperate circumstances have fewer options than Georg had in 1945. The chaos and gaps that allowed his deception have been systematically closed. Whether this represents progress depends on how you weight the benefits of verification against the costs of inescapable documentation. Another dimension of this issue concerns refugees and undocumented immigrants. Georg was, in effect, an undocumented immigrant, someone present in the United States without legal authorization. His eventual path to citizenship occurred only after he'd built a life over 60 years, established his peaceful intentions, and convinced authorities that prosecuting him served no purpose. Modern undocumented immigrants face a very different situation. Verification systems make it nearly impossible to work legally without proper documentation. The political climate around immigration has become increasingly hostile. Paths from undocumented status to legal residency have become more restricted rather than more accessible. Georg's story demonstrates that it's possible for someone to enter a country without authorization, build a productive life, integrate into communities, and eventually achieve legal recognition. His case could be read as an argument for more flexible immigration, systems that recognize the reality of people who've built genuine lives and connections, regardless of their initial legal status, but it could also be read as an argument for stricter enforcement. If someone could evade detection for 40 years, doesn't that demonstrate dangerous gaps in security and verification systems that need to be closed? These opposing interpretations reflect broader philosophical disagreements about immigration, sovereignty, and the balance between security and opportunity. Georg's story doesn't resolve these disagreements, but it illuminates them by presenting an extreme case that challenges easy categorization. Georg Gärtner's relationship to place evolved through several distinct phases. He began as someone from Schweidnitz, a German town in Silesia. This was his homeland in the most fundamental sense, the place he was born, where his family lived, where his identity was formed. The war transformed him into someone from nowhere, a soldier fighting in North Africa, far from home, then a prisoner of war in New Mexico, even further from home, then an escapee with no home at all, since his original homeland had been erased by border changes and Soviet occupation. As Dennis Wiles, he became someone from California. Not born there, but formed there through decades of accumulated experience. The ski slopes where he taught, the communities where he lived, the landscape he inhabited daily. These became his geography of belonging in a way that Schweidnitz, even in memory, could never be again. This transformation from Schweidnitz to California, from Georg to Dennis, from German soldier to American citizen, represents a kind of geographic and personal metamorphosis that was characteristic of the mid-20th century, but became increasingly difficult in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The post-World War II period saw massive population displacements. Millions of people found themselves in places other than where they'd been born, unable or unwilling to return to homelands that had been destroyed, occupied, or transformed beyond recognition. These displaced persons had to create new identities, new senses of belonging, new relationships to place. Many maintained connections to their lost homelands through exile communities, groups of people from the same regions who preserved language, culture, memories. They created little Polands and little Ukraines and German-speaking neighborhoods, spaces where the lost homeland could be partially recreated. Georg did the opposite. He severed connection to his lost homeland almost completely. He didn't seek out German exile communities. He didn't maintain German cultural practices. He didn't tell stories about Schweidnitz. He performed instead a more radical act of geographic transformation. He simply became Californian, with only the trace of his accent remaining to suggest origin elsewhere. This choice has psychological implications. Maintaining connection to a lost homeland provides continuity, a sense that your identity remains rooted even when displaced, but it also means perpetual mourning for what's been lost, continual reminder that you're living in exile rather than at home. Georg's approach avoided this perpetual mourning by accepting the loss completely. Schweidnitz was gone. Georg Gärtner from Schweidnitz was gone. What remained was Dennis Wiles from California, a person created through choice and sustained performance rather than accident of birth. The question of whether this represents successful adaptation or traumatic severance doesn't have a simple answer. Psychology would suggest that completely cutting off from your origin creates its own problems. Unprocessed trauma, unintegrated identity, psychological fragmentation. But maintaining constant connection to an irretrievable past creates different problems. Inability to move forward, perpetual exile mentality, refusal to fully engage with present circumstances. Georg's choices suggest a third option. Accept the loss completely. Invest fully in creating a new identity. Allow the past to recede until it becomes almost irrelevant. Whether this constitutes healthy adaptation or elaborate avoidance is difficult to determine from outside his subjective experience. His refusal to ever visit Świdnica, even after it became possible, suggests that he'd made a deliberate decision not to confront the physical evidence of his hometown's transformation. Better to maintain the memories of Schweidnitz untainted by the reality of what it had become. Better to fully inhabit California than to maintain one foot in an irretrievable past. This decision reflects a broader human capacity for radical geographic reorientation. We think of place-based identity as fundamental. Where you're from shapes who you are in supposedly indelible ways. But Georg's life demonstrates that it's possible, under sufficient pressure, to essentially abandon one place-based identity and fully adopt another. The success of this adoption is evident in small details. He taught skiing in a distinctly American style, adapted to American clients and American mountains. He organized charity events with American celebrities. He married an American woman and built an American life. When he finally revealed himself, he did so on American television, speaking comfortable, if accented, English. His performance of American identity had become substantially real. Every long-term secret creates a kind of archaeological layering in the life of the person carrying it. The deeper layers, the original truth, are buried under accumulated years of cover stories, evasions, and performances. Excavating down to that original truth requires careful work, because each layer has become compacted and hardened by time. For Georg, the original truth was buried under 40 years of Dennis Wiles. And even before that, the truth of his wartime experience was buried under whatever silences soldiers carry home from combat. His life contained multiple layers of concealment, each serving different functions, each requiring different strategies to maintain. The wartime experience itself was something he rarely discussed in detail. This silence was characteristic of combat veterans across all sides of World War II. The things seen and done in war often exceed the capacity of language to convey them. Even without any particular atrocity or trauma, the sheer intensity of combat creates experiences that resist narrative translation. Many veterans emerged from World War II with stories they couldn't or wouldn't tell. They'd seen friends killed. They'd killed enemies. They'd witnessed destruction on scales that overwhelmed comprehension. They'd lived for extended periods in states of fear, exhaustion, and hypervigilance that fundamentally altered their neurological responses to the world. Georg's silence about his military service might have been simply this: the common veteran's inability to find words for combat experience, but it was also complicated by his particular position as a German soldier who later became American. How do you discuss fighting for Germany to an American audience? How do you contextualize your role in Hitler's war? Easier perhaps to simply not discuss it, to let that layer remain buried. Above this layer of military silence was the layer of false identity. The Dennis Wiles persona required constant maintenance, remembering the cover story, responding to questions consistently, avoiding situations that would require documentation he couldn't provide. This layer was active and effortful, requiring deliberate choices multiple times every day. Above that was the layer of normal life: teaching skiing, organizing events, maintaining friendships, being a husband. This layer wasn't false exactly. It was genuine lived experience, but it was built on the false foundation of the layers below, which meant it could never be completely secure. The revelation to Jean and then to the public represented an archaeological excavation, bringing the buried layers to the surface, exposing them to light, integrating them with the surface layer of Dennis Wiles's life in California. This excavation was necessarily incomplete. Some things remained buried. The specific details of his military service were never fully disclosed. The precise circumstances of his capture, his time in the POW camp, his decision-making process around the escape, these were described only in broad outlines. Some silences persisted even after the larger secret was revealed. This partial excavation is typical of late-life revelations. People who finally disclose long-held secrets rarely disclose everything. The habit of concealment, built up over decades, doesn't disappear instantly. And some things perhaps genuinely can't be discussed, either because they've been forgotten, or because they remain too painful, or because they implicate others, or simply because the person has decided some secrets will remain secrets forever. For historians trying to understand Georg's life, this creates challenges. The public record contains the broad facts: Wehrmacht sergeant captured in Tunisia, escaped from POW camp in New Mexico, lived as Dennis Wiles for 40 years, surrendered on television in 1985. But the internal experience, what it felt like to jump that train, to create a false identity, to maintain the performance for decades, to finally reveal himself, remains largely inaccessible. We have a few interviews where Georg discussed his motivations and experiences, but these interviews occurred after the revelation, when he was in his 60s and 70s looking back on decisions made in his 20s. Memory is reconstruction rather than recording. His narratives about his younger self were necessarily shaped by decades of subsequent experience. The Georg who jumped the train in 1945 was a different person from the Georg who surrendered in 1985. The younger Georg was acting on immediate fear, calculating odds, making desperate choices. The older Georg was narrating those choices retrospectively, giving them coherence and meaning they might not have had in the moment. This gap between experience and retrospective narration exists for everyone's life, but it's particularly pronounced for someone whose life included such dramatic discontinuities. Georg couldn't maintain a simple linear narrative where young Georg became old Georg through natural progression. He had to integrate the transformation of Georg into Dennis, and then the revelation of Dennis as Georg. These discontinuities resisted smooth narrative integration. One of the more haunting aspects of Georg's story is that we'll never know the full truth about his military service because virtually all potential witnesses are gone. The men he served with in the Afrika Korps, the people who knew him in Schweidnitz before the war, his family members, most or all are dead now. Georg himself died in 2013, taking his unshared memories with him. This creates a kind of epistemological loneliness around his story. We know the facts that can be verified through documents: his capture, his imprisonment, his escape, his life as Dennis Wiles, his surrender. But the subjective experience, the internal motivations, the full context of his choices, these are accessible only through his own testimony, given decades after the events, This is true of all historical figures to some degree. We're always working with incomplete information, reconstructing past experiences from fragmentary evidence. But it's particularly acute for someone like Georg, whose entire life strategy was built on concealment and whose story only became public near the end of his life. Consider what we don't know. Did Georg have family in Schweidnitz who survived the war? If so, did they search for him? Did they assume he died in Soviet captivity when he never came home? Did they eventually die without ever learning he'd escaped to America and built a new life? What happened to his hometown friends if he had any? Did he have a girlfriend before the war? What happened to her after Schweidnitz became Schweidnica? In the POW camp, did anyone help him plan his escape, or did he act entirely alone? Did other prisoners know of his plans? Did anyone try to stop him or report him? When he first arrived in California, how did he survive the initial months? He must have had some money or resources. You can't teach skiing immediately upon arrival. Did he do agricultural labor? Construction? How did he transition from fugitive desperately hiding to confident ski instructor with a constructed identity? Were there close calls during the 40 years? Moments when someone almost recognized him, or asked too many questions, or created situations where his cover was nearly blown? These questions have no answers now. The witnesses are gone. Georg himself left no detailed memoir. What we have is the broad outline of an extraordinary life. But the texture of that life, the daily experience of living as Dennis Wiles while being Georg Gärtner, is largely lost. This loss is characteristic of marginal histories. The experiences of people living outside official systems, evading documentation, maintaining false identities. These experiences rarely get fully recorded. They exist in memory, in oral tradition, in fragments and hints, but they don't leave the kind of documentary evidence that historians prefer. Georg's late-life interviews provide some information, but they're limited by the constraints of the interview format. Journalists asked questions they found interesting, which weren't necessarily the questions that would have provided the richest historical understanding. Georg answered in ways shaped by his personality, his sense of what should be disclosed, his desire to control his own narrative. A fuller account would require extensive oral history interviews conducted over many sessions, with interviewers trained to ask follow-up questions, to circle back to contradictions, to probe gently at the edges of what Georg was willing to discuss. Such interviews apparently never occurred, or if they did, they haven't been made public. The result is that Georg's story exists in a curious state, well known in its outlines, mysterious in its details. Everyone interested in World War II prisoner stories knows about the German POW, who escaped and lived 40 years under a false identity. But few people know what that experience actually felt like from the inside. Georg Gärtner's legal status throughout his 40 years as a fugitive existed in a remarkable twilight zone. He was technically a prisoner of war who had escaped, but the war he was a prisoner of had ended. He was technically a fugitive, but he'd committed no crime beyond the escape itself. He was technically in the country illegally, but he'd been brought to the country against his will. This combination of circumstances meant that traditional legal categories didn't quite fit. He wasn't a criminal in any conventional sense. He hadn't harmed anyone, hadn't stolen anything beyond his own freedom, hadn't engaged in any activity that would normally be considered criminal. But he also wasn't innocent. He deliberately escaped lawful custody and lived under a false identity, both of which violated laws. The Geneva Conventions, which govern the treatment of prisoners of war, contain provisions about escape attempts. Soldiers who attempt escape are generally not punished severely. Escape is considered a duty, and recaptured prisoners typically face only brief detention. But these provisions assume that escape attempts occur during active combat, not after the war is ended. Georg's escape in September 1945 fell into a gray area. The war was over, but he hadn't yet been repatriated. Was he still technically a prisoner of war, or had he become some other category of detainee? If he was no longer a prisoner of war, what was the legal basis for holding him? And if there was no legal basis for holding him, could his escape even be considered illegal? These questions were never fully resolved in court because Georg was never prosecuted. The decision not to prosecute was pragmatic, rather than based on a clear legal determination of his status. By 1985, prosecuting him simply didn't serve any useful purpose. But the decision not to prosecute raises interesting questions about the nature of law and the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Laws are supposed to apply equally to everyone, but in practice, prosecutors make constant decisions about which violations to pursue and which to ignore. These decisions are based on factors like the severity of the crime, the likelihood of conviction, the allocation of limited resources, and the broader social purpose that prosecution would serve. In Georg's case, all these factors pointed toward not prosecuting. The crime was old, relatively minor, and motivated by circumstances that no longer existed. Prosecuting would have required significant resources to achieve little clear benefit, and the broader social purpose, deterring future POW escapes, was irrelevant since there were no POW camps to escape from. So the legal system essentially decided that while Georg had technically violated laws, those violations were old enough and context-specific enough that formal legal consequences were unnecessary. Instead, he was granted legal residency status and eventually allowed to naturalize. This pragmatic resolution reveals something important about how legal systems actually function, as opposed to how we sometimes imagine they function. We think of law as a set of clear rules that are applied mechanically. If you violate Rule X, consequence Y follows automatically. But actual legal practice involves enormous discretion at multiple stages. Police deciding whether to arrest, prosecutors deciding whether to charge, judges deciding how to sentence, immigration officials deciding whether to deport. This discretion allows the system to handle exceptional cases like Georg's without creating dangerous precedents. By not prosecuting him, the legal system avoided having to make definitive rulings about his status that might have created complications for future cases. The informal resolution, essentially, saying this is too complicated and too old to bother with, so we'll just regularize your status and move on, allowed the system to dispose of Georg's case without establishing clear precedents about POW status after war's end, about the statute of limitations on escape, about the rights of individuals whose homelands have been erased by geopolitical changes. This avoidance of precedent setting was probably intentional. If the courts had ruled definitively on Georg's legal status, that ruling might have created obligations or permissions that would apply to future cases with different facts. Better to handle it administratively, case by case, maintaining maximum flexibility. But this approach also reveals something troubling about legal systems. They're more flexible for some people than others. Georg received lenient treatment partly because he was sympathetic, an elderly man, non-violent, with an understandable motivation for his original escape. His race, his eventual integration into middle-class American life, his ability to present himself as respectable, all these factors likely influenced the decision not to prosecute. Someone with a less sympathetic presentation, younger, poorer, non-white, unable to marshal media attention and public sympathy, might have faced very different treatment for identical actions. The discretion that allowed Georg to avoid prosecution is the same discretion that leads to wildly disparate treatment of similar cases throughout the legal system. This observation isn't meant to suggest Georg should have been prosecuted more harshly. Rather, it highlights that the flexibility and humanity shown in his case should be more broadly available. But our legal systems tend to reserve that flexibility for people who fit certain profiles, while applying rigid rules to others. Georg's path to citizenship, beginning with his surrender and concluding with naturalization in 2009, also reveals the peculiar plasticity of legal status. He went from fugitive to legal resident to citizen over the course of 24 years. Each transition required the legal system to essentially forgive previous violations, to treat his illegal presence and false identity as surmountable obstacles rather than permanent disqualifications. This forgiveness was possible partly because of the passage of time. By 1985, his escape was 40 years old. By 2009, it was 64 years old. The person who jumped the train was so distant from the person seeking citizenship that they seemed like different individuals. The legal system essentially decided that enough time had passed that Georg's past violations needn't permanently define his status. But again, this temporal forgiveness isn't equally available. Many people with much older violations, sometimes from childhood or young adulthood, find those violations following them permanently, creating barriers to employment, housing, citizenship, family reunification. The legal system showed Georg remarkable mercy in allowing his past to be overcome. That same mercy is routinely denied to others. In his various interviews after surrendering, Georg Gärtner was asked repeatedly whether he regretted his escape, whether he felt remorse for the deception, whether he would do things differently if he could. His answers to these questions reveal a complex relationship to his own choices. He consistently maintained that the escape itself was necessary given the circumstances. He'd faced repatriation to Soviet-occupied territory, with well-founded fears about what would happen to German soldiers there. Given the information available in 1945 and the options he perceived, escaping was the rational choice for survival. This framing is notable because it avoids moral categories like guilt or remorse. Georg presented his decision as pragmatic calculation rather than moral failing. He wasn't apologizing for escaping. He was explaining why escape made sense given the alternatives. Regarding the false identity and the deception of Jean and others, his responses were more complex. He acknowledged that living under a false name created difficulties and caused pain to people who cared about him. But he also presented this as unavoidable given his circumstances. Maintaining the false identity wasn't optional. It was the necessary cost of avoiding repatriation. This reasoning has a certain logic. If the initial escape was justified, then the false identity required to sustain that escape was also justified. You can't coherently say I was right to escape but wrong to hide. Hiding was intrinsic to successful escape. But this logic sidesteps some uncomfortable questions. Was marrying Jean under a false name justified? Even if maintaining a false identity generally was necessary, did that necessity extend to intimate relationships? Should he have remained single, or revealed his true identity before marriage even at the risk of exposure? Georg apparently didn't think so. He chose to marry, to share his life with someone even though doing so required perpetuating the deception. This choice caused Jean significant pain when the truth was eventually revealed. Whether that pain was an acceptable cost of Georg's survival and happiness is a question that doesn't have a clear answer. Different ethical frameworks would evaluate this differently. A consequentialist approach might focus on outcomes. Georg survived, built a good life, contributed to his community, and eventually revealed the truth. The overall consequences were arguably positive, or at least not catastrophically negative. The deception was a means to achieving these outcomes. A deontological approach focused on duties and principles might reach a different conclusion. There's a duty to be honest with one's spouse, to not enter marriage under false pretenses. This duty doesn't disappear because of extenuating circumstances. From this perspective, Georg's choice to marry Jean while maintaining the deception was wrong, regardless of his broader situation. An ethics of care approach might focus on relationships and their maintenance. Georg's deception harmed his relationship with Jean by creating asymmetry and eventual betrayal. But it also protected their relationship by allowing it to exist in the first place. Jean's decision to stay after the revelation suggests she found the relationship valuable enough to preserve despite the deception. Georg himself seemed to navigate between these frameworks without committing fully to any. He acknowledged harm but maintained necessity. He expressed regret for causing pain but not for the choices that caused that pain. He presented himself as someone who'd done what was required for survival and tried to minimize collateral damage. This position is probably the most honest response available to him. Clean moral narratives. I was completely justified and regret nothing, or I was wrong and deeply remorseful, would both be oversimplifications. The truth is messier. He made choices that were understandable given his circumstances. Those choices had both positive and negative consequences, and evaluating them requires weighing incommensurable values. The public response to Georg's story suggests widespread acceptance of this moral complexity. Most coverage treated him sympathetically, presenting his escape as understandable and his subsequent life as redemptive. The deception was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. The narrative became, man faced impossible circumstances, made difficult choices, ultimately built a good life. This sympathetic framing might have been different if his life as Dennis Wiles had been violent or destructive. If he'd committed crimes, harmed others, failed to integrate productively into American society, the moral evaluation would likely have been harsher. The 40 years between escape and surrender became, in effect, a long demonstration of his worthiness, proof that the escape was about survival rather than malicious intent. But this raises troubling questions about conditional sympathy. Do we only forgive deception when the deceiver turns out to be productive and harmless? What about people who escape desperate circumstances but struggle to build stable lives, who face ongoing trauma and difficulty? Do they deserve less understanding? Georg's story became palatable partly because he succeeded. But success in sustaining a false identity for 40 years required not just determination, but also luck, privilege, and circumstances that many people in similar situations wouldn't have. His story shouldn't be read as proof that anyone in desperate straits can simply create a new life through force of will. The gaps in the system that allowed his deception have largely closed. The social and economic conditions that allowed him to work and integrate without extensive documentation no longer exist. In this sense, Georg's story is historical in a double sense. It's history because it happened decades ago, but it's also history because the conditions that made it possible belong to a past era. Someone in Georg's position today would face very different obstacles and would likely reach a very different outcome. Every person carries within them an archive of experiences, memories, and identities. For most people, this archive has a single organizing principle, the continuous self that persists from birth through present. You are the child you were, the teenager you were, the young adult you were, accumulated into the person you are now. Georg Gärtner's internal archive was more complex. He contained Georg Gärtner from Schweidnitz, the boy and young man who existed before the war. He contained Georg Gärtner, the Wehrmacht soldier, who fought in North Africa and became a prisoner of war. He contained Georg Gärtner, the escapee, who jumped the train and made the terrifying decision to disappear. And he contained Dennis Wiles, the identity constructed and maintained over 40 years until it became as real as any identity based on documentation. How did these different selves coexist within a single consciousness? How did he maintain coherence across such dramatic discontinuities? Psychological research on identity suggests that we're constantly constructing and reconstructing our sense of self through narrative. We tell ourselves stories about who we've been and who we are, and these stories provide continuity even when circumstances change. But these narratives assume a basic consistency. Your name remains your name, your past remains your past, even as you interpret them differently over time. Georg had to maintain multiple incompatible narratives simultaneously. The public narrative of Dennis Wiles with its fabricated orphan backstory and present-oriented life. The private narrative of Georg Gärtner, with its memories of Schweidnitz and the war and the escape. And the meta-narrative that integrated these two. The story of how Georg became Dennis and maintained that becoming for 4 decades. Only the meta-narrative was complete, and it was the one he couldn't share with anyone for 40 years. The public narrative was deliberately incomplete, full of evasions and fabrications. The private narrative was complete but couldn't be voiced except in the most private internal spaces. This fractured narrative structure must have created profound psychological strain. Narrative psychologists argue that coherent life stories are essential for mental health. They allow us to integrate our experiences, find meaning in our choices, understand ourselves as continuous beings persisting through time. But Georg couldn't construct a coherent public narrative because doing so would require revealing information that would expose his fugitive status. The cost of this fractured narrative was likely chronic, low-level dissociation, not the acute dissociation of trauma, where consciousness fragments in response to overwhelming experience, but a sustained dissociation where part of yourself must remain hidden, where your public presentation and private reality exist in separate compartments that can't be fully integrated. After the revelation to Jean and then to the public, Georg could finally begin integrating these fractured narratives. He could tell the complete story. Georg who became Dennis, who was really always Georg. The meta-narrative could finally be voiced, shared, witnessed by others. This integration likely provided enormous psychological relief. The burden of maintaining separate narrative tracks, of constantly monitoring what could be said to whom, of never being able to share his complete story. All of this could finally be released. But integration also created new challenges. For 40 years, Dennis Wiles had been his primary identity, with Georg Gärtner relegated to private memory. Now he had to publicly be both simultaneously. People who'd known him as Dennis for decades had to revise their understanding to accommodate Georg. He had to learn to respond to both names, to integrate both histories into conversations, to help others understand the relationship between his two selves. The documentary record from his later years suggests he navigated this reasonably successfully. He gave interviews as Georg Gärtner discussing his life as Dennis Wiles. He maintained relationships with people who'd known him as Dennis while acknowledging his identity as Georg. He became, publicly, a person with a complicated history, rather than a person with a false identity. This public integration was possible only because American culture has some capacity to absorb and accommodate complex personal histories, the immigrant experience, the refugee experience, the experience of people who've had to flee and reinvent themselves. These are recognized, if not always fully understood, as part of the American story. Georg's narrative could be fit into this broader framework. He became another example of someone who'd come to America under difficult circumstances and built a new life, even if the specific details of his case were more extreme than most. But some elements of his internal archive likely remained private. Combat memories that couldn't be shared, specific experiences from his time in the POW camp, the texture of fear during the escape and the early years of hiding, the precise emotional quality of maintaining the deception with Jean. These internal experiences, if he preserved them at all, probably remained unshared. This is true for everyone to some degree. We all have experiences that resist verbal expression, memories that remain private, internal states that can't be fully conveyed to others. But for someone whose entire life was structured around concealment, the private regions of the internal archive were probably more extensive than for most people. One way to understand Georg Gärtner's life is to consider the parallel lives he didn't live, the alternative paths that were available at various decision points, and what they might have produced. If he'd accepted repatriation in 1945, he would have returned to Soviet-occupied Silesia. His hometown of Schweidnitz was being transformed into the Polish city of Świdnica. The German population was being expelled. Soviet authorities were treating returning German soldiers with suspicion, often imprisoning them or sending them to labor camps. Some German soldiers who returned to Soviet-occupied territories did survive, eventually integrating into the German Democratic Republic or Poland, or simply disappearing into the vast Soviet system. Georg might have been among them. He might have survived the initial interrogations, avoided the worst labor camps, eventually built some kind of life in the Eastern Bloc. But the odds were not favorable. And even if he'd survived physically, he would have lived in a very different world. Communist-controlled, economically devastated, politically repressive. The life he actually built in California, with its freedom and prosperity and opportunities, would have been impossible in Soviet-occupied territory. Alternatively, he might have requested repatriation to West Germany. This would have been complicated. Silesia wasn't becoming West German territory, and he had no connections to the Western zones. But hypothetically, if he'd managed to be repatriated to Western Germany, he would have arrived in a country devastated by war, occupied by Western allies, undergoing the difficult process of denazification and reconstruction. West Germany in the late 1940s and 1950s offered more opportunities than the Soviet zone, but it was still a difficult environment. Food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, collective guilt, and trauma from the war. Georg would have been one of millions of displaced persons trying to rebuild lives from nothing. He might have succeeded. Many did. The German economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s created prosperity and opportunity. By the 1980s, West Germany had become one of the world's wealthiest nations. A parallel Georg who'd returned to West Germany might have built a comfortable life, perhaps even become financially successful. But he would have carried a different relationship to his past. In Germany, his Wehrmacht service would have been part of the collective reckoning with Nazi history. He would have lived through denazification, through the student movements of the 1960s that forced a new generation to confront their parents' complicity, through the ongoing process of historical memory and responsibility. The Georg who jumped the train and became Dennis Wiles avoided this reckoning. He escaped both Soviet occupation and German guilt. He built a life in a country where his Wehrmacht service was a distant foreign matter, where he wasn't forced to confront it daily, where he could simply be Dennis the ski instructor, rather than Georg the former German soldier. This escape from historical reckoning was probably psychologically easier in the short term, but it meant carrying unprocessed history privately. The parallel Georg who stayed in Germany would have had to confront his wartime experience more directly, but would have done so in the company of millions of others engaged in the same process. Another parallel life. Georg could have surrendered immediately after escaping, turning himself in within days or weeks. This would have resulted in recapture and likely repatriation, so it quickly collapses into the already considered repatriation scenarios. But there's a more interesting parallel. What if Georg had revealed himself earlier? Not in 1985 after 40 years, but in 1965 after 20 years? Or 1975 after 30 years? An earlier revelation would have occurred in a different political and cultural climate. In 1965, World War II was only 20 years past, not 40. Anti-German sentiment, while faded, was stronger. The Cold War was at its height, which might have made his anti-Soviet motivation more sympathetic, but might also have made authorities more suspicious about his activities. An earlier revelation would also have meant revealing himself at a younger age, with more life ahead of him. The calculation about whether to continue hiding or surrender would have been different. In 1985, at age 63, Georg had already lived most of his life. The years remaining were limited. In 1965, at age 43, he would have had potentially decades ahead, and the decision to spend those decades as a revealed fugitive versus continuing as Dennis Wiles would have had higher stakes. These parallel lives illuminate the contingency of the actual life Georg lived. At multiple points, different choices would have led to radically different outcomes. The life we know, 40 years as Dennis Wiles, then revelation and eventual citizenship, was just one path through a forest of possibilities. This contingency raises philosophical questions about identity and fate. Was Georg always destined to become Dennis Wiles, or was it a historical accident that could easily have gone differently? If he'd been captured even a few months earlier in North Africa, he might have been repatriated before the full extent of Soviet occupation became clear, changing his calculation about escape. If he'd been held at a different POW camp with better security, escape might have been impossible. The life he actually lived was the product of countless small contingencies: the timing of his capture, the location of his imprisonment, the specific circumstances that made escape feasible, the gaps in American identification systems that allowed him to build a false identity, the luck of never being discovered during 40 years, the timing of his revelation just as attitudes toward such cases were becoming more lenient. Change any of these variables and the story transforms completely. This awareness of contingency should make us humble about drawing grand conclusions from Georg's case. His success in escaping and building a new life wasn't inevitable. It was the product of specific circumstances that might not be replicable. When Georg Gärtner died in 2013 at age 86, he left behind not just a widow and whatever other family connections he'd maintained, but also a legacy of questions that can never be fully answered. His story becomes, after his death, something that belongs to history, rather than to living memory. This transition from living memory to history is always poignant, but it's particularly so for someone whose life was defined by secrets and revelations. The people who knew Georg personally, who spoke with him, heard his voice, observed his mannerisms, experienced him as a living person rather than a historical figure, carry knowledge that can't be fully conveyed through documents and recordings. Jean, his widow, is presumably the person who knew him most completely. She knew him as Dennis for 20 years, then knew the truth for 30 years. She experienced both the deception and the revelation, both the fractured identity and the integrated identity. Her understanding of who Georg was and what his life meant is probably richer and more complete than anyone else's. But Jean's understanding is also subjective and particular. She knew Georg as a husband, which is different from knowing him as a friend or as a historical subject or as an example of broader patterns. Her knowledge is deep but narrow, intensely detailed about certain aspects of his life, probably less informed about others. After Georg's death, Jean became the primary custodian of his story. Whatever interviews she's given, whatever documents she's preserved, whatever stories she's chosen to share, these shape how future generations will understand Georg Gärtner. But she also has the right to privacy, to keep certain things private, to refuse to answer certain questions. This creates an inevitable gap in the historical record. We'll never know everything about Georg's life, because the people who knew things have reasons to keep some things private. This is as it should be. Not every detail of someone's life belongs to history, but it means that accounts of Georg's life will always be incomplete. Beyond John, there were presumably other people who knew Georg well. Friends, colleagues, students he taught skiing, people he organized charity events with. Their memories and perspectives also matter, but they're probably more fragmented and less comprehensive than Jean's. Some of these people might not have known about his dual identity until the 1985 revelation. For them, the experience would have been shocking, discovering that someone they thought they knew was actually living under a false name. Their post-revelation memories would be colored by this knowledge, making it difficult to access their pre-revelation understanding of who Dennis Wiles was. This is a general problem with revealed deceptions. They retrospectively alter how we understand the past. Once you know someone was living under a false identity, it's almost impossible to recover your original naive understanding of who they were. The knowledge contaminates memory, making it difficult to separate genuine characteristics from false presentation. For historians working on Georg's case, these limitations are frustrating but insurmountable. We can access documents, his military records, his POW camp files, FBI wanted posters, immigration documents, news coverage of his surrender. These provide factual scaffolding, but the subjective experience, the internal life, the texture of what it felt like to be Georg Gärtner, these are accessible only through testimony that's necessarily limited and colored by retrospective knowledge future. Researchers might uncover additional documents. Military archives might contain more detailed service records. POW camp files might include information about his time in custody. FBI files might document their search for him. German archives might contain information about his hometown and family, but these documents will still leave gaps. They'll tell us where Georg was and what he did, but not why he made particular choices, how he felt about them, what internal dialogue he carried on with himself during the 40 years of hiding. This is the fundamental limitation of historical knowledge. We can reconstruct external facts more easily than internal experience. And for someone whose entire life was structured around concealing internal truth, this limitation is particularly acute. Georg Gärtner's story, while historically specific, resonates with contemporary experiences in ways that might not be immediately obvious. We live in an era of unprecedented documentation and surveillance, where maintaining a false identity for 40 years seems almost fantastical. Yet people continue to navigate complex relationships between official identity and lived experience. Consider undocumented immigrants living in the United States. They're present without legal authorization, often working under false social security numbers, maintaining a separation between their official non-status and their actual lives as workers. Neighbors, parents, community members, the constant vigilance required, the fear of exposure, the inability to fully participate in civic life. These parallel Georgs experience in important ways. The moral evaluation of these situations often depends on factors similar to those that made Georg's story sympathetic. If undocumented immigrants are working hard, contributing to their communities, raising families, staying out of trouble, we tend to view them more sympathetically than if they're involved in crime or dependent on social services. But this conditional sympathy is troubling because it suggests that only deserving people merit compassion, while others can be expelled or punished without concern. Georg's story also resonates with experiences of people in witness protection programs, who must adopt new identities and maintain them permanently for their own safety. Unlike Georg, these people have official sanction for their false identities. But the psychological experience, maintaining a performance, concealing your past, living with constant vigilance is similar. It resonates with experiences of transgender people who've transitioned and built lives in their authentic gender, only to face potential exposure of their assigned gender at birth. The need to control information about your past, to maintain boundaries around certain aspects of your history, to navigate situations where official documents might not match your lived identity. These create parallels with Georg's situation. Though the underlying circumstances are very different, it resonates with anyone who's had to significantly reinvent themselves. People escaping abusive relationships, individuals recovering from addiction who've built new lives, people who've served prison sentences and are trying to integrate back into society, the desire for a clean break from the past, the feeling that your previous identity has become a trap, the wish to be known only for who you are now rather than who you were. These are common human experiences that Georg's story illuminates in extreme form. The surveillance technologies that have closed off the gaps Georg exploited create their own problems. Yes, they make it harder for criminals to evade justice and harder for people to commit identity fraud, but they also make it harder for people to escape. Circumstances that have made their legal identities dangerous or unlivable. The right to be forgotten. The idea that people should be able to have information about their pasts removed from public access reflects a recognition that permanent documentation of everything you've ever done can be oppressive. Georg achieved a crude version of being forgotten by simply disappearing and creating a new identity. Modern advocates for digital privacy and the right to be forgotten are grappling with how to achieve similar outcomes in a more documented world. Georg's story also speaks to questions about redemption and second chances. His 40 years as Dennis Wiles became, in effect, a demonstration that he deserved a second chance, proof that he could build a productive, peaceful life if given the opportunity. The legal system's decision not to prosecute him after his surrender essentially validated this demonstration. But not everyone gets 40 years to prove themselves deserving of a second chance. The surveillance and documentation systems we've built often create permanent marks on people's records that follow them indefinitely. A criminal conviction, a bankruptcy, a foreclosure, a bad credit score. These can create barriers that persist for decades, limiting opportunities for employment, housing, credit, sometimes citizenship. Georg essentially gave himself a second chance by escaping and creating a new identity. Modern systems are designed to prevent people from doing this, which means the only legitimate path to a second chance is through official channels: parole, record expungement, bankruptcy discharge, credit repair. But these processes are often slow, difficult, and incomplete. They rarely provide the clean break that Georg achieved through his radical act of self-reinvention. This raises difficult policy questions. Should we make it easier for people to escape their pasts? Should there be more robust mechanisms for second chances, for record clearing, for allowing people to move forward without their entire history following them? Or do we need permanent records and accountability to maintain social trust and prevent harm? There are no easy answers to these questions. But Georg's story suggests that sometimes radical reinvention is necessary for survival, and that preventing it entirely might not be desirable even if it were possible. Georg Gärtner lived long enough to tell his story publicly, to regularize his legal status, to become an American citizen. In that sense, his story has an ending, not entirely happy perhaps, but resolved. He achieved what he'd sought: survival, a life built on his own terms, eventual recognition and acceptance. But in another sense, his story remains unfinished. The broader questions it raises about identity, belonging, documentation, and the legacy of World War II don't have resolutions. They're ongoing questions that each generation must grapple with anew. The specific historical circumstances that created Georg's dilemma, the redrawing of borders after World War II, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the displacement of millions of people, these were particular to that moment. But the underlying dynamics of war creating impossible choices, of borders changing while people remain in place, of legal identities becoming incompatible with survival, these recur constantly. We see them in contemporary refugee crises, where people flee circumstances that make remaining in their home countries impossible, but find that legal pathways to safety are blocked or inaccessible. We see them in situations where ethnic or religious minorities become targets of persecution and must choose between staying in dangerous circumstances or fleeing to uncertain futures. Georg's decision to escape rather than accept repatriation was his own, made in his specific circumstances. But it exemplifies a broader human behavior. When faced with impossible official options, people create unofficial alternatives. They cross borders without permission. They work without authorization. They live under false identities. They do whatever's necessary to survive. Modern states have invested enormous resources in preventing these unofficial alternatives. Border enforcement, workplace raids, identification verification systems, surveillance technologies, all are designed to eliminate the gaps that people like Georg exploit. The goal is to create a world where your legal identity determines your possibilities completely, where there are no spaces outside official recognition. But this goal is probably unachievable and possibly undesirable. Human ingenuity at creating workarounds exceeds state capacity for enforcement, and a world where no escape from official identity was possible would be a world where people in circumstances like Georg's had no options at all. The tension between state desires for comprehensive documentation and human needs for flexibility and escape is probably permanent. Georg's story represents an extreme case of this tension, but the underlying dynamics play out constantly in less dramatic ways. His story also leaves unresolved questions about historical memory and responsibility. Georg served in the Wehrmacht, which means he was part of Hitler's military machine. He wasn't SS, he apparently didn't commit war crimes. He fought in North Africa rather than the Eastern Front where the worst German atrocities occurred. But he was still part of the larger enterprise of Nazi Germany's war. After escaping, he never underwent the kind of formal denazification that Germans in Germany experienced. He never had to confront his role in Nazi Germany's wars in the structured way that German society eventually forced on its members. He simply moved on, became Dennis Wiles, and left that history behind. Is this troubling? Does it matter that he avoided that reckoning? Or was his personal reckoning, the decision to escape rather than return to Silesia, the construction of an entirely new identity, the decades of carrying that history privately, its own form of confronting the past? These questions don't have definitive answers. They depend on what we think historical responsibility means, whether it requires formal processes or can be satisfied through private reflection, whether avoiding confrontation is itself a form of confrontation. Germany's post-war history has been marked by ongoing grappling with Nazi crimes and collective guilt. This process has been difficult and painful, but most historians agree it's been necessary and ultimately healthy. Germans who avoided this process by emigrating or hiding their pasts arguably escaped, something they should have confronted. But Georg's case is complicated by the fact that he wasn't escaping responsibility for war crimes. He was escaping a different danger, Soviet occupation and its potential consequences for German soldiers. The moral weight of his escape was different from someone fleeing prosecution for atrocities. Still, the question remains, should he have returned to Germany, West Germany, not Soviet-occupied territory at some point? Should he have voluntarily subjected himself to denazification proceedings even belatedly? Or was his choice to build an entirely new life in America an acceptable alternative? The fact that he lived 40 years without confronting these questions publicly, then surrendered and was not required to confront them by American authorities, means they remain unresolved. His personal account of his military service was minimal. He provided few details. He didn't engage in the kind of deep historical reckoning that might have clarified his role and responsibility. This incompleteness is probably inevitable. By the time he revealed himself publicly, he was in his 60s, 40 years removed from his wartime service. The detailed memories that might have allowed fuller accounting were probably inaccessible or lost. And there was no institutional mechanism forcing him to provide that accounting. So his story remains unfinished in this dimension. We know he served in the Wehrmacht. We know he was captured in Tunisia. We know he feared Soviet repatriation, but the fuller story of his military service, his understanding of what he was participating in, his moral reckoning with that participation, these remain largely private and inaccessible. Georg Gärtner's gravestone, marking his final resting place in California, bears both of his names, Dennis F. Wiles and underneath, Georg Gärtner. This dual inscription perfectly captures the irreducible complexity of his life. He was both people, neither name alone sufficient to identify who he was. The decision to include both names suggests an acceptance of his dual identity, a recognition that he lived authentically as both Georg and Dennis, that these weren't entirely separate people, but different aspects of a single complicated self. Most of us are buried under our birth names, with our legal identities marking our graves. Georg required both names because neither alone told the truth about who he'd been. This duality extends beyond the gravestone. His obituaries struggled with how to identify him. His life story resists simple summary. He was a German soldier who became an American citizen. He was a fugitive who became a respected community member. He was Georg, who became Dennis, who was always still Georg. The fundamental lesson of his story might be that identity is more fluid and constructed than we usually acknowledge. We think of identity as fixed. You're born with a name, a nationality, a history, and these constitute who you are in some essential way. But Georg demonstrated that it's possible to construct a new identity so thoroughly that it becomes real. Dennis Wiles was a fiction, but he was also genuine. The life Georg lived as Dennis was authentic, lived experience, even if built on a false foundation. The relationships he formed, the work he did, the person he became through daily choices over decades, these weren't false just because the name was invented. This suggests that identity might be less about documentation and legal status and more about accumulated experience and chosen commitments. You become who you decide to be, through sustained performance that eventually ceases to be performance at all. But Georg's story also reveals the costs of this kind of radical self-reinvention. The constant vigilance, the inability to share your full self with others, the fear of exposure, the weight of secrets, the damage to intimate relationships, the parts of your history that must remain unspoken. For most people, the costs of maintaining a false identity would exceed any benefits. We're better off with the freedom that comes from living openly under our own names, even if that means carrying whatever burdens our pasts create. The price of authenticity might be high, but the price of sustained deception is higher. Georg's circumstances were extraordinary enough that the calculation came out differently for him. The danger he faced from Soviet repatriation was real and immediate. The benefits of escaping justified the costs of hiding, but his case was exceptional, and probably shouldn't be generalized into broader lessons about when deception is justified. What does generalize is the recognition that legal categories sometimes fail to capture human complexity. Georg was simultaneously fugitive and community member, deceiver and honest neighbor, German soldier and American citizen. These categories seem contradictory, but they all applied to him simultaneously. Our institutions, legal systems, immigration bureaucracies, documentation requirements, struggle with this kind of ambiguity. They want clear categories, definitive statuses, unambiguous identities. But human lives often resist these neat classifications. Georg's story became manageable for authorities only after 40 years had passed, and he demonstrated, through sustained behavior, that he fit into acceptable categories: nonviolent, productive, integrated. At that point, the legal system could pragmatically resolve his status without having to make difficult determinations about his wartime role or the legitimacy of his escape. This pragmatic resolution worked for Georg but doesn't provide clear guidance for future cases. Each situation would require similar case-by-case evaluation, similar exercises of discretion, similar balancing of incommensurable factors. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson, that complex human situations often can't be resolved through application of clear rules, that they require judgment, flexibility, and willingness to recognize ambiguity. Georg's story challenged the systems designed to categorize and track him. Those systems eventually accommodated him, not by changing their rules but by exercising discretion, to treat him as an exceptional case that didn't need to fit perfectly into existing categories. When we consider Georg Gärtner's life in its totality, from his birth in Schweidnitz to his death in California, 86 years later, what emerges is a portrait of extraordinary adaptability in the face of historical catastrophe. He was born into a world that would be destroyed by the time he reached adulthood. The town of his childhood would cease to exist in any recognizable form. His country would commit unspeakable atrocities and then be defeated and divided. The geopolitical order of his youth would be completely overturned. Many millions of people experienced similar devastation during the 20th century. Wars, revolutions, border changes, political upheavals. These created vast populations of displaced persons, refugees, people whose identities were no longer anchored to any stable homeland. Most of these people responded by maintaining connections to lost homelands while building new lives in new places. They formed exile communities, preserved languages and cultural practices, told stories about the places they'd come from. They carried their original identities forward, even as they adapted to new circumstances. Georg's response was more radical. He didn't maintain connection to Schweidnitz or German culture. He didn't join German-American communities or speak German socially. He performed instead an almost complete severance, becoming Dennis Wiles so thoroughly that Georg Gärtner receded into distant memory. This approach had psychological costs, but it also had benefits. He wasn't perpetually mourning a lost homeland. He wasn't living in exile, always looking backward to a place that no longer existed. He was fully present in California, building a life forward, rather than dwelling on irretrievable past. Whether this was healthy psychological adaptation or elaborate avoidance is impossible to determine from outside his subjective experience. Perhaps it was both simultaneously, a necessary adaptation that came with inevitable costs. The broader historical significance of Georg's story lies in what it reveals about the post-World War II period, particularly the displaced persons crisis that followed the war's end. The Allies had to deal with millions of people who couldn't or wouldn't return to their pre-war homes. These included concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, prisoners of war, refugees who'd fled advancing armies, ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern European territories. The international system created to handle this crisis, displaced persons camps, repatriation programs, refugee resettlement was overwhelmed and often inadequate. Many people waited years in camps. Many were forcibly repatriated to places they didn't want to go. Many fell through bureaucratic gaps. Georg's escape represented one individual's refusal to accept the solution the system had determined for him. He decided his fate for himself rather than accepting official determination. This act of self-determination was technically illegal, but it was also understandable and ultimately successful. How many others made similar choices? How many displaced persons faced with unsatisfactory official options simply disappeared into unauthorized alternatives? We know about Georg only because he eventually revealed himself. The historical record probably contains many gaps where people successfully evaded official systems and built unofficial lives. This hidden history of people escaping official channels parallels the documented history of displaced persons, camps, and resettlement programs. Both were responses to the same crisis of massive displacement, but they involved very different strategies. The official system attempted to categorize, document, and relocate people through bureaucratic processes. The unofficial system involved individuals making desperate choices to survive outside official recognition. Georg's eventual regularization. His path from fugitive to legal resident to citizen suggests that the line between official and unofficial could sometimes be crossed, that people who began outside the system could eventually be integrated into it. But this integration required specific circumstances. Enough time passing that initial violations seemed less significant. Demonstration of peaceful intentions and productive behavior, political and cultural conditions that made authorities sympathetic. Not everyone who starts outside official systems finds paths to eventual integration. Many remain permanently unauthorized, permanently vulnerable to deportation or prosecution. Georg was fortunate or strategic enough to time his revelation at a moment when integration became possible. In his final years, after surrendering and regularizing his status, Georg apparently lived with a kind of peace that had been unavailable during the 40 years of hiding. The constant vigilance could finally end. The burden of secrets could be released. He could speak openly about his full history, rather than maintaining careful compartmentalization. Jean's decision to stay with him after the revelation made this final period possible. Without her acceptance and support, Georg might have achieved legal resolution but remained socially isolated, his personal relationships damaged beyond repair by the revelation. Instead, he had companionship and understanding during his final decades. This suggests that successful integration after revelation requires not just legal accommodation, but social acceptance. Institutions can grant legal status, but they can't provide the intimate connections that make life meaningful. Georg needed both, legal regularization and personal acceptance, and was fortunate to receive both. When he took the citizenship oath in 2009, he was 83 years old. He'd lived in America for 64 years at that point, longer than most native-born Americans. The oath formalized what had long been true in practice. America was his home, had been his home for decades, would be his home until his death 4 years later. The official recognition came very late, but it came. The invented identity was eventually legitimized. The fugitive was eventually welcomed. The man with two names was eventually allowed to carry both publicly. His death in 2013 closed the story in biographical terms, but opened it in historical terms. Once he was gone, his life became material for interpretation rather than ongoing experience. Historians, journalists, and others interested in his case could analyze his choices, evaluate his decisions, place him in larger contexts. These interpretations will inevitably be incomplete. The subjective experience of being Georg Gärtner, of jumping that train in 1945, of maintaining a false identity for 40 years, of finally revealing the truth, this internal experience died with him. What remains is documentary evidence, testimony from others, his own public statements about his life. From this evidence, we can construct narratives, draw conclusions, identify patterns, but we should remain humble about our capacity to fully understand experiences so far outside normal human life. Georg's story pushes against the boundaries of what most of us can imaginatively comprehend. The gravestone with its two names stands as a permanent marker of his complicated life. Future visitors who see it might wonder about the story behind the dual inscription. Some will know the history, others will simply note the oddity and move on. But the names themselves tell the essential truth. He was Georg Gärtner from Schweidnitz, who became Dennis Wiles from California. Both identities were real. Both names deserved to mark his grave. His life couldn't be reduced to either name alone. It required both to capture who he'd been. In the end, Georg Gärtner's story is about the remarkable human capacity to survive impossible circumstances through radical adaptation. Faced with the erasure of his homeland and the threat of Soviet imprisonment, he chose to erase himself instead, to become someone new, to build a life from nothing, to sustain that construction for 4 decades until it became as real as any identity, based on birth and documentation. The cost was high: constant vigilance, chronic secrets, damaged relationships, unintegrated identity. But the alternative, as he understood it in 1945, was higher: probable imprisonment or death, loss of freedom, life in a system he feared and wanted no part of. Whether we judge his choice as justified depends on what we believe about individual rights versus state authority, about survival versus legal compliance, about the flexibility we're willing to grant to people in desperate circumstances. The American legal system eventually decided that his choice, while irregular, didn't warrant punishment. Society more broadly seemed to accept that his story had sufficient complexity to resist simple moral judgment. He became neither hero nor villain, but something more ambiguous, a man who'd made difficult choices in impossible circumstances and somehow survived to tell the tale. That tale, now complete with his death, remains available for future generations to interpret. Each era will probably read it differently, finding in Georg's choices reflections of their own concerns about identity, immigration, documentation, belonging, and the price of survival in a world that often offers no good options. The last of Hitler's soldiers in America was never really Hitler's soldier at all. He was a young man from a vanishing town who calculated the timing of a freight train and jumped into 40 years of carefully constructed fiction that eventually, somehow, became real enough that a grateful nation eventually decided to call him citizen. His grave lies in California soil, marked with both his names, both his identities, testament to a life that couldn't be contained by a single name, a single nation, a single simple story. He was Georg and Dennis, German and American, soldier and civilian, fugitive and citizen, all of these simultaneously and none of them completely. And perhaps that irreducible complexity is the truest thing about him, that he resisted categorization, exceeded boundaries, lived in the spaces between official designations. In a century that destroyed millions through rigid categorizations, racial, national, political, he survived by refusing to accept the category assigned to him and creating his own instead. The freight train he jumped carried him not just away from a prisoner of war camp in New Mexico, but away from a past that had become unlivable, and toward a future he would construct through sheer determination and sustained performance. That journey lasted not just the hours or days of the physical escape, but 40 years of psychological journey from Georg to Dennis and finally back to Georg, who was also Dennis. It was a journey that shouldn't have been possible, that violated laws and norms and expectations. But it was a journey that worked, that allowed survival, that produced a life. And in the end, the legal system and society looked at that life, looked at the decades of peaceful, productive living, looked at the person he'd become, looked at the extraordinary circumstances that had prompted his extraordinary choices, and decided that perhaps survival itself was justification enough. The Last Soldiers' War was not the war of 1939 to 1945. It was the 40-year war of maintaining an identity that would protect him from the consequences of that earlier war. He fought it alone, without weapons or allies, using only vigilance and sustained performance. And somehow, against considerable odds, he won. His victory was being allowed to live, to build a life, to eventually tell his story, to die as an American citizen, recognized and accepted, his complicated history acknowledged rather than punished. To rest under a stone bearing both his names, neither erased, both present, both true. In a world that demanded he be only one thing, he successfully insisted on being two things. And eventually, improbably, the world agreed. That might be the most remarkable part of this remarkable story.